Oh, goody.
All right, what's going on, everybody? Zombies here again, and today we're back with another Marvel Snap video. So in this one, we are kicking off the start of the Black Order season with 2 new cards, one of which is going to be joining us via Season Pass, and the other through tokens or spotlight caches. Black Swan is going to be our Season Pass card, coming in as a 3/5 that says on reveal, until the end of next turn, your 1-cost cards cost 0. And then joining us in spotlights is Supergiant, who is a 4/5 that reads, on reveal, all cards played next turn don't reveal until the game ends. Both of these look like some pretty solid cards with a decent amount of hype around them, so today we're going to talk about them a little bit, the spotlight caches for this week, as well as go over our day 1 decks. Starting out with Black Swan. Black Swan 3/5s, generally a very good stat line. Mana cheating, really powerful. I do think, like Scar before her, she is going to be a little bit limited in terms of which decks actually end up using this card, since you want a critical mass of 1-cost cards in order to get the most mileage out of this effect. So things that come to mind are obviously any Thanos deck, since you're making the stones free, which is very powerful. And then other than that, Zoo decks are probably the other main thing, decks that are trying to fill out all the lanes as much as possible with cheap 1-cost cards. And I think Black Swan does a really good job of helping fix up an issue where Zoo usually wants to play its buffing cards on turns 4 and turns 5. So if you get out Black Swan on curve on turn 3, you can fill out with a bunch of 1-drops in your hand that you might not have time to play otherwise, or that might compete with whatever else you want to do on the final turn of the game. So really like that. Solid stats, has a very clear and powerful function, but it's definitely not going to be a card that goes in a majority of decks, and I think that's totally fine. So if you like those style of decks, Season Pass is an easy pickup, but if you aren't a fan of those kind of decks, I don't think you'll be missing out too much by not picking this one up. And then Supergiant. So Supergiant is a Series 5. She is joined this week with Darkhawk and Zabu in the Spotlight caches. I think most players who've been around for a while probably have Darkhawk and Zabu. They are archetype defining cards. So this is a really good week probably if you are a newer player who has Spotlight saved up and doesn't have these cards. Zabu is arguably like the best card in the game, and Darkhawk is one of the best cards to pair with it. So if you for some reason do not have these cards already, this is probably a really good Spotlight week. I think the ideal line with this card is going to be teching against powerful turn 5 plays. Some things that come to mind are things like Sarah or Legion or Leech. Basically, when your opponent gets a powerful 5-drop down on 5, and the fact that it is on the board drastically changes how the final outcome of the game is going to go, specifically for having that effect going into the final turn. And against those types of decks and strategies, I think Supergiant will probably be fairly good. So I'm not sure if there are enough of those decks doing that kind of specific thing right now that are going to make this a really popular tech card inclusion, but who knows? Sarah's popular, Jane Thor stuff is popular, that's another one it hits. Evo is generally always kind of popular, so there are a lot of good hits for this card if you get it down on turn 4, which is when it is probably going to be played most of the time, as playing it on turn 5 doesn't do anything really, and playing it on turn 3 requires having some sort of ramp or Zabu to make it happen. Now the other obvious combo here is Alioth, so destroying your opponent's unrevealed cards is pretty good with a card that makes it so your opponent doesn't get to reveal cards for a turn. And yeah, that's going to be a powerful interaction when you make it work. I do question how consistently the decks that run both these cards are going to actually make that interaction worse. It also requires your opponent to play into it a bit, right? Like, if they're playing cards face down and they know there's a decent chance you're an Alioth deck, odds are they're not going to play more face down cards if you have priority in the same lane. It's just kind of opening yourself up to being totally blown out. I'm sure it'll happen to some people who don't think about it, but I think most competent players can reasonably play around that. Nonetheless, kind of cool for people who enjoy doing that type of stuff. And I do think this is a card people are very much not going to like playing against when it shows up. But that's really going to depend on how popular it is. And personally, I think this card is kind of overhyped. I think it's a fine card, not a bad card, but and there are a lot of decks that I don't think really mind this effect too much. You also have to keep in mind that you are affecting yourself with this ability. So Not only is your opponent not getting their cards revealed on that turn, but you aren't either. So that can be a double-edged sword. That is not always a positive thing, as a lot of cards have effects you want to get off. A lot of people are thinking about running this in like a Darkhawk style deck, and yeah, there's a benefit there. Maybe you hide your Darkhawk behind her, which is kind of cool. Use her to keep the Darkhawk hidden until the end of the game without having to play it on the final turn, and that's neat. But what if you want to play some of your other cards, like putting rocks in the deck? Yeah, they'll shuffle at the end of the game, but they have no chance of denying your opponent a draw, which is one of the more powerful aspects of putting rocks in their deck. So I do think a little bit of a double-edged sword there, and I think the card is kind of just like in the mid territory. But again, kind of hard to evaluate. We've never really had an effect like this on a card before, so I guess we'll see. But for me, I do not think I would recommend spending 6k tokens on this card. It looks like this month might be all Series 5 card releases, which we haven't had happen in a long time. And if you're going to be busting out 6,000 tokens on a Series 5 card, you want to make sure it's going to be one that is really, really impactful, and especially compared to the other things that are releasing later this month, I'm not sure that Supergiant is that. And then in terms of caches, this is another one where I think unless you don't happen to own these cards already, that this is a pretty hard pass. I mean, it's 2 Series 4 cards, so if you're missing only one, you could pick that up for tokens for only 3k, which is kind of better. And then a lot of players are going to have them, so unless you're really pining after those variants, I think this week is just an easy skip. But yeah, those are the cards. Let's take a look at our day 1 decks. So we're going to start off with Black Swan, and you might notice she's a 2/3 here. That was her original design, but apparently they changed it before release. Not currently updated on some of the deck building websites yet, but she is a 3/5, not a 2/3. Important to keep that in mind. So the first deck, not too much to say about this one. Thanos Lockjaw. Yeah, this deck is still really, really good, even after the nerf to Blob. And Black Swan just seems like a really natural inclusion here. We're putting her in the wave spot, as I think that was the easiest one to replace with another powerful 3/5. And I think Black Swan enables some really sweet things for this deck. Ideally, being able to play Black Swan or having her pop out of the Lockjaw, enabling you to really spam down stones, whether that's throwing one into the Lockjaw on a turn where you wouldn't be able to otherwise. For example, you could go Lockjaw on turn 3, you could go Black Swan and a stone into Jaw on turn 4, and that enables you to play a 5-on-5 like your Dino or Vision or Leech, while still being able to throw something into the Lockjaw if you have a stone in your hand, since it won't cost anything. Free stones are really powerful. We saw that with Quinjet in the past with old Thanos. Obviously back then you could toss multiple into the Lockjaw once, it was really busted. But I think in general, you know, the stones are a big part of what makes Thanos powerful, and being able to make them free seems really, really strong. So nothing really else to change about this deck. Maybe another card like Cull Obsidian will be added in later on in the season. But for the time being, I think Black Swan just has a good chance of improving this deck quite a bit. And if you want to do something a little bit less traditional in the Thanos shell, we have Thanos Zoo. So I've always really liked Thanos Zoo because you have all the stones, you're kind of putting out a bunch of cheap 1-drops and then you can buff them up, and it's a lot of fun. And I think this is another card where it's just going to make that strategy way, way better, because one of the big issues this deck had was sometimes you get to turn 6 and you just haven't been able to play out all the 1-drops you've drawn throughout the game. So maybe you don't have enough on the field to get proper value or use out of your Valkyrie, or maybe you feel like you have to play some of those 1-drops instead of just slamming your Spectrum or a Blue Marvel, and it can get kind of awkward. This also enables you to get out all those Thanos stones, so hey, maybe Thanos will actually be a little bit more of an option here in terms of slamming him down for the big 20 points of power. I've played quite a bit of the Thanos Zoo archetype though since the change to Blob, and I've liked it quite a bit. I think Black Swan is just a pure upgrade. This deck also really appreciates the change Dazzler got last patch. Dazzler is really, really strong in this archetype, and the nice thing about all the Thanos stones is we don't actually have to run a whole ton of 1-drops ourselves outside of those. So we do have the kind of cream of the crop here of 1-drops. We have the Hood, who's good with Valkyrie and as well with Nico, enabling us to blow up the Hood and draw, or just transforming the Hood into a demon before getting another demon, both really strong. Ant-Man goes very well with Valkyrie, as does Dazzler, and Nebula just as another kind of premier 1-drop. I do think if you want to experiment with different ones, Nebula is probably the one you've replaced, but so far she's been fairly decent, though she does lose value the later in the game you play her, so that's something to keep in mind if you want to try out a different option. We have Kyera to protect our threats, Khazar and Blue Marvel to scale up our board, Valkyrie to flip a lane, and Spectrum as an alternate play for the final turn of the game to boost up our board. And I think Black Swan will be really nice here. Being able to play it out on turn 3 lets us spam a bunch of cheap one-cost cards. At the same time, we're playing our Khazar or Kyera or something. And that feels really strong, especially in Thanos when those stones are cycling and it's letting us see more of our deck. So hopefully we find the specific cards we're looking for in a given matchup. Then last but not least, we have a bit of a normal Zoo deck here. So if you want to do Zoo shenanigans but without the Thanos things, the deck ends up looking really similar, except the only difference is we do cut Spectrum and Thanos out of there in favor of some more 1-drops. So those additional 1-drops are Spider Ham for some more interaction, and Squirrel Girl, who's very handy with both Valkyrie and Dazzler. But other than that, the core is the same here. We're just trying to spam out a lot of cheap cards and then get the benefit from buffing them up and spreading the power throughout the board, with Valk and Ham acting as ways to tech against some of the bigger, scarier threats that are normally a lot too big for this deck to compete with. It's possible you could go a few different directions with Zoo, but this is the core I've found to be the strongest, so it's the one I'm going to be trying out. And then moving on to Supergiant. So the first list is probably the most cookie cutter list of the bunch, and it almost builds itself, right? It's really just, hey, we're putting Zabu in the deck, so we're going to put in the best of the best 4-drops. So we get Darkhawk, Shang-Chi, Miss Marvel, Iron Lad, and Supergiant. Then we have very powerful 1-drops in Korg and Nebula, Zabu to make our 4s cheaper, Jeff for the flexibility and because he's good with Miss Marvel, Widow and Rock Slide, Premier 3-drops, enabling the Darkhawk strategy, and Doctor Doom, really good with Miss Marvel, really good off Iron Lad, just one of the best 6-drops in the game. Not too much to say about this. It's a stock list. It does what the Darkhawk stuff does, except now you can sometimes screw over opponents who are really reliant on that turn 5 play. So maybe this helps you against a Sarah deck, or as previously mentioned, maybe you just hide your Darkhawk after the Supergiant, so that way your opponent is less likely to know where it's going to be to interact with it towards the end of the game. And then for our Alioth enjoyers, we have a pretty standard Storm list. I think this one will be fairly solid, but again, I'm not sure if Supergiant's going to be the difference maker here. So we have some early 1-drops in Nebula and Iceman. Iceman, kind of an underrated card right now, in my opinion. You often don't see how impactful he really is, because your opponent does instead of you, but as someone who's ran up into it quite a few times recently, it is really, really annoying, and it is a good thing in helping keep priority by making your opponent play off curve at times. 2-drops running Zabu and Jeff, premier 2-drops for this style of deck. Storm to close down a lane, limit our opponent's options so we get more Alioth value, and hopefully the Supergiant can also contribute to that. Gladiator, just because we wanted another big stats card for our 3-drop. Miss Marvel to spread the power around. Jessica Jones is a good thing to slam in the Storm lane. Iron Lad, big high roll card here, good on Miss Marvel, really good on Doom, good on Alioth sometimes if we have priority. There are just a lot of good hits on Iron Lad. He's kind of one of the best 4-drops in the game for these style of decks that are looking to maximize the utility out of these powerful effects. One thing that's kind of nice about this deck, you may notice, is that it is not running any 5-drops itself. Sometimes these lockdown decks run Vision and whatnot, but this one isn't. This one is all in on its 4-drops and cheaper stuff with its 2 big 6-cost threats to end the game. So we don't really have to worry about our Supergiant effect being too negative for us, because we're really not trying to play anything on 5 that is going to have an impact on the game most of the time. Do just be aware, it does have some negative synergy with something like Jessica Jones, so you will want to get her down before the Supergiant if possible if you're going to be playing her that game. And the last deck of the bunch is just a big stats deck, and this is probably the one I think is going to be most fun. We're just trying to get priority by any means necessary in the early game, and then use the Supergiant Alioth combo to close out the late game. So we are running the highest stat 1-drops possible in Martyr and Ebony Maw, with 0 as a way to turn off their negative effects. Zabu because of all the 4s, Jeff for the flexibility, Lizard acts as another target for our 0 if we don't get the other cards, and he's just a 2/5 if your opponent's not filling out the lane, which is really good. Gladiator, again, big stats for cost. Miss Marvel spreads the power around. Man-Thing, I think this card has been kind of forgotten with time, but he can be a really impactful one in terms of just completely blowing out a lane where your opponent has committed a bunch of smaller things. You can slam a Man-Thing there, or maybe you even hide it behind the Supergiant, and then they won't expect such a big point swing when it reveals at the end of the game. Since this deck is trying to get ahead and stay ahead, we have Crossbones as our resident 4/8 to just put power on the board in a lane we're already winning, and then hoping to close out the game with Alioth. If we take that priority, we'll hopefully use this to finish off the game and maybe get some extra value if we can hit some Supergiant cards on top of it. Definitely the most experimental brew of the bunch, but I do think it might be the most fun to play just because it gets to use a lot of cards that don't really see a whole ton of play right now. And that's going to wrap it up for our day 1 decks for Black Swan and Supergiant. As always, links to these decks will be in the description below if you want to import them into the game for yourself. Let me know in the comments what you think about the decks, what you think about these cards, picking them up, are you passing? I'd love to hear it. It's going to wrap it up for this one though. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, remember to like and subscribe, and I'll catch you in the next one. Peace.